Scott Pendlebury from the Collingwood Football Club. You're listening to the Coaches Panel.
This is Patrick Crouch from the Carlton Footy Club. You're listening to the Coaches Panel.
Max Holmes, Melbourne Football Club. You're listening to the Coaches Panel.
Number 39 in the 50 most relevant players for SuperCoach, AFL Fantasy and Dream Team for 2025. We are talking about Geelong defender mid Max Holmes. He was a midfielder for us last year. He was one of the best breakout options who also gained positional allocation during the season. What's he going to do for us in 2025? We will talk about that as we head into this episode of the 50 Most Relevant. Joining me is fellow Coaches panelist, host is too kind of a word, co-host of the AFL Fantasy Fanatics podcast, teaming up with Bales, Tim and Jaden. It is Jordox. Hello, mate. How are you?
Good, mate. Thanks for having me on. Good to be here. Disappointed I didn't get to talk about my boy Pete Lang yesterday, but that's all right. Looking forward to the guy we've got today.
He's such a good player to talk about. A seasonal average of 94.5 in AFL Fantasy has meant that he's coming in at a price point almost $1 million, in and around that 950 marker in Dream Team and just almost 970,000 in SuperCoach. He's coming in a little bit of a different price range because of an average of 99. He's up at that $530,000 price point. Played 23 games for us last year and gave us a career-high SuperCoach score. Granted, it was in finals. So just telling you that now, it was in finals. It was the 152. So that is a career-high score from him. A little bit lower when it comes to season proper, but we wanted to slide that factor in there for you. While in AFL Fantasy, his top score last year was also a career-high score. It was a 120 against the Demons. Jordox, Max is someone that I've loved watching for a long time. If you're a Patreon of the Coaches Panel, and if you're not, you can subscribe, get involved. All the details in the description of the episode. They know my deep love of Max Holmes because through our keeper ranks, he's been in that top 50 the last couple of years. And finally, owners have seen that reward with this movement of a 20 points per game bump up from the 70s now into the 90s. And it came off a couple of core things, didn't it, Jordox? His speed was always on display. His high work rate was always on display. But then he moved into this halfback role over the first third of the year. And we now started to see him create, make the play, not get lost in the wings where he'd previously been, but now through that halfback role and later in the year, the accompanying centre bounce midfield role, we got to see his strengths as a powerful, fast midfielder and halfback playmaker fully on display.
Yeah, it was a great year for him. Great year for keeper owners, like you said. I mean, we really saw a level of consistency from him that, you know, in his previous few seasons, obviously he's just starting out in his career. But for a fourth year, I think it was last year, to be so consistent and to have his floor scores just come right up. It was a shame his year sort of petered off a little bit. And I know in AF he had a handful of scores in the 70s, which stopped him from really getting close to the ton for the average. But that first half of the year was exceptional. The whole first, probably before the buys, was all high 80s to low tons.
It was exceptional. He's the number one player when you look per game averages. He's the number one player in the AFL for metres gained. He's fourth in the league for taking a bounce, which again, helpful for SuperCoach, not so much for AFL Fantasy. The thing that probably we should talk about at some point in the podcast, though, fourth in the league for turnovers. So when he's getting the ball, he's being adventurous. He's not being wasteful, but it is turning into moments where opposition are intercepting and bringing the ball back the other way. But the average last year of 94.5 in SuperCoach, 8 tons. Just that one ceiling game, though, of 120, but it's balanced out by a really high scoring floor with just 3 scores sub 80. And as you mentioned, they're all in the back, like 2 months of the year. The first half of last year, one of the safest 85, 90-plus scorers rolling around for us. While in SuperCoach, a 99 average, 11 tons, 3 over 120. And again, we see that high-scoring basement with just 2 scores sub 80. In AFL Fantasy, 7th by average and for points amongst all defenders and 14th in SuperCoach for both points and by average. It was, while never quite getting to the top echelon of defensive premium, he did everything that is a breakout option we wanted to. And as you've mentioned, he's now just hitting the peak of his powers. And there could be a world we see another evolution and another elevation of his scoring in 2025.
It'll be interesting to see, because he goes now from that consistent scorer, but what we're really looking for in this price range is those ceiling scores. So his biggest in AF was a 120, which is good, but that's where you're going to need to see the lift to make him a worthwhile pick this year. And honestly, I think he can, and I think he will. Geelong are so to start Holmes, you've really got to be confident that he's going for the ton this year. He's going to average over 100. Now, I can see that happening. There's a couple of things that probably make me think maybe he could just have a stabilizer year where he only averages 94, 95 again. But for him to get over that 100, he'd have to be the first cat since 2021 to average over 100 in AF and DT. So It's been a few years. Geelong haven't been a huge scoring side in fantasy. And then the other thing, the cat in the room, still elephant in the room, but obviously the acquisition of Bailey Smith. What does that mean for Holmes in terms of his position? And you might have some numbers on the CBAs, but we saw first half of the year more of half back, and then we saw him in the guts as Geelong started to do things a little differently, and that included Tom Stewart going into the middle as well, if you remember. So the midfield balance of Geelong is going to be really curious. But the other thing I'd say to all that is I don't actually think it matters where he plays. He might be like a Jack Sinclair, where he's probably better for the fantasy world off half back anyway.
Yeah, that's a fair shout. Like the scoring split for Holmes as a centre bounce, heavier mid-roll as opposed to less. In AFL Fantasy, it's pretty negligible. I think it's a point or two. So it's not really there. And there were only 3 games last year where he didn't attend a centre bounce anyway. It was just we saw that split move up higher from round 9 onwards. He was really the playmaker off half-back. He didn't take many kick-ins anyway. In SuperCoach, it's a little bit more evident. Like in 14 SuperCoach games last year, he went at 40% centre bounces and less, and went at a 101. When it's over 40, we're now talking in the mid-90s. So there is a little bit more impact in SuperCoach, but not a massive one. I love that you've brought up this Geelong midfield mix and what it could look like, with Bailey Smith really being the preeminent variable that's going to change it. Because last year, they're one of the few teams that doesn't have a midfielder running at 70% centre bounce attendance or more. It's a really big split. Like Danger's going at 66 last year. Bruins are going at 55. When Parfitt did play, who's now out of the side, it's 55. Atkins is 54. Bowes is 39. We barely saw a Cam Guthrie. Clark didn't really come on last year. Sean Manor, who'd done it at VFL level, got the odd instance through there. And now the arrival of Bailey Smith. And then there's the Holmes option, who was in and around that, sometimes 5%, sometimes 50-odd%. How do you see this Geelong midfield reshaping with and around a Bailey Smith? And probably the real question I had for you, can a Bailey Smith and a Max Holmes coexist at the same centre bounce? Because to me, they're very similar style of players, which is high endurance athletes, high initial sort of 3 to 15 metres turn of pace, and not both great users of the football historically. Can they both coexist at the same centre bounce, or does something else happen? What's your read on this Geelong midfield, Jordox?
Yeah, they can both coexist in the same centre bounce. I don't think it's going to be the optimal group of 4 to have the 2 of them in there because of the similarities you said. I think it's going to be a really interesting year for Geelong. See where Tanner Bruin's at. See, what are they going to do with Jack Bowes? I don't think any of us know what they're doing with him. He looks okay when he's in there, but then the next week he's the sub. So I'm not sure there. I think Guthrie, it's hard to see him really returning. I mean, if he's fit, they'll put him in there, but I could see him moving off to a flank. Danger when the body's right, he's in there. So there's a bunch. I think you'll find Holmes is pushed out slightly of the centre bounces, but not to his detriment in fantasy, because Smith comes in, like you said, the similarities, but Holmes is just as good for us off half-back, and that's where I want to see him. I want to see him picking up some kick-ins. You touched on that before. I think he was fifth in line for kick-ins at the Cats, and really, if he just had an extra 2 a game, he averages 100 in AF. So, his ball units isn't great, but he's still young. So I think that'll develop. I think they're going to want to put the ball in his hand.
Imagine what's possible when learning doesn't get in the way of life. At Capella University, our game-changing FlexPath learning format lets you set your own deadlines so you can learn at a time and pace that works for you. It's an education you can tailor to your schedule. That means you don't have to put your life on hold to pursue your professional goals. Instead, enjoy learning your way and earn your degree without missing a beat. A different future is closer than you think with Capella University. Learn more at capella.edu.
It's more as he matures, and I think he's going to get better for us as he gets pushed more to.
And if that halfback role does eventuate, to me, that's where I'm most interested in him, because SuperCoach, I did mention that scoring slide a little bit when he attends centre bounce. But to be fair, his 2 130-plus scores that he did during the home and away season came when he was in that heavier centre bounce role. So that's promising. But I look at that Geelong midfield mix and do see a world with the arrival of Bailey Smith. They can allow Holmes to drift back, become the run and carry distribution unit off half-back. He can be that heavy metres gain player. He can be that rebounder. He can get involved in the score involvements. He can start to, as you've mentioned, maybe start to pick up an extra clip of kick-ins with Zach Tui now retired and out of the Geelong side. To me, this feels the more favourable place from a fantasy lens that he might be able to pick up his scoring. And so if, as you've mentioned, we do see this happen, I'm really quite interested in Max Holmes. One of the things that helps protect the selection around Max is they do play in opening round against the reigning premiers in Brisbane. One of the risks of that, having a free look at him, is it means he's going to have one of those earlier buys for us. So their opening sort of 2 months of the year is the Lions opening round. Freo, St Kilda, favourable, that game for us from a fantasy perspective. The buys, which they share with the Lions and the Cats and the Suns. So I don't know, what's your take on top-end premiums or near the top-end premiums that in our defensive line that have an early buy? Is he ruled out of your starting squad because he sits in an opening round game and has an early buy, or is there still a world for you where a coach could consider starting with him?
Yeah, no, I'd like to start him. I think last year when we had our first exposure to the early buys and opening round, some of the lessons I took from last year was don't be too wary of players on the early buys, because the best 18 protects you and they come and go pretty quick. Once they're gone, they're gone. So I wouldn't let that deter me unless I had, a really large amount of players from the same buy round, obviously. But best 18 really does nullify a lot of that for me. The only thing that would be with not picking those players is if you're picking them for cash development. Obviously that's a week they miss out on, but they do gain the week from opening round. No, I'm really keen to start Holmes at this point. I mean, there's still a lot of water going under the bridge, and let's have a look at him in opening round with Bailey Smith and see what that does look like. But the thing I like about Holmes, and this is possibly more looking well beyond this year, is his score build. I mean, he, for a guy that does a lot of meters gained and that sort of style, I was surprised to look at his careers numbers, and he can lay a tackle, Holmes. So his tackles went down in 24, but in 2023 he averaged 4 tackles a game, which is pretty good for a third-year kid. So I guess my point is there will be games where he doesn't take his 6, 7, 8 marks, and that affects the score, but he still gets the pill. I mean, he only had one game last year where he had less than 20 touches, and his tackling was down, but That's what I mean. That's why he reminds me so much of Sinclair. He could be off half back, running up and down, quick plus sixes, lots of marks. Or he could go into the middle if Geelong needs, and he can lay 6-7 tackles a game, if that's the type of game. So I'm really optimistic on him. I must say I always am when I do research players to have these chats with you. They always end up because I talk myself into it. But I loved him last year, and I was disappointed in his finish, but I actually think his slower finish has kept his price down, and I think makes sense for a young player with so much. He's been through a bit in his career. He had that early injury that saw him miss the grand final 2022. And then you can even argue his injury in the prelim against Brisbane last year, the whole game shifted, and the Lions, the rest is history. So he's a super important player. He's great to watch. He's got a good score build. And there's not a heap of defenders. We've talked about this. There's not a heap of defenders at the very top, that you're going to be willing to pay for. So he's just below your Whitfields and your Flanders and Sinclairs, but I can see him adding and becoming a 100 guy this year.
And I think one of the attractions around Holmes, if you're looking to start him, is you get a look and a see at opening round, not just in terms of role and structure, but also it gives you some stability to know, what am I starting my season with? So I think that's an attractional piece. You've mentioned that high-scoring floor. You're not going to get burnt starting Max Holmes in your side because he's so strong with his speed and his work rate and his endurance to get into space either by creating it himself or finding it in the game. He's going to do those scoring elements that just protects when you're spending the dollars that you are, which again is that high thousands in AFL Fantasy Dream Team, that nearing DK price point in SuperCoach. You're like, okay, I've got opening round. I can look what it sees in a real game of football. I know that even in that midfield role, let alone the halfback role, the basement is not going to hurt me, and I'm not going to get a Luke Ryan type, who we've added in the 50 most relevant a handful of days ago, that has a world where he could drop 10, 15 points per game in the first month. And now not only have I wasted, quote unquote, cash at the start, I'm way underperforming what my expectation is. I don't think Holmes will deliver that for you. There's two things for Holmes that I think you need to factor in if you are starting him. With the main one, if you start him, yes, he's got the early season bye, but in our defensive line, he shares that bye with others that we are strongly considering. Kadeem Coleman, Matt Roberts, Callum Mills, Harry Perryman, gosh, even a Dan Houston, if you want to go a little bit unique, all sit in this defensive line, let alone what you do in those other spots. So as right as you are that we are protected with a best 18, if you're not careful and you haven't tiered out who you want as the value options in each line and your overall buy structure, you could get to round 4 and be like, I'm a Mills owner, I'm a Roberts owner, I'm a Holmes owner, I'm a Coleman owner, and all present value, absolutely. It could leave you with just one or two defenders on field and really struggling to get to that best 18. So that would be the only flag that I would have. But I love how bullish you are on him. Is there anything that you would see in the preseason or opening round that would deter you from having him as a starting squad option?
There's a long way to go. It could just be how I feel on the day, the way I'm playing with my stuff now. But I think if something came out of Geelong that said, something that was like, we want to move him into the middle. We don't want to see him half back. We want to open that up for Guthrie. We're going to lock Stewart back into that role. If we had that sort of commentary out of Geelong, but I can't see it because Bailey Smith comes in. I do think they need to get more consistent games into Bruin and keep his time on ground up. Because he performs well, he just doesn't play a lot on field. And again, you know what? Almost the biggest question in this conversation is Jack Bowes. Because where does he land? Because he'll be entering his third year as a captain, and I'm no closer to knowing what they're going to do with him from the day they got him in that crazy trade with the Suns. So that's probably it for me. Probably what you said about the bye, the round 4 bye, probably have to have a bit of a closer look at that, the rest of my squad. But at this point in time, I just loved Holmes last year. I wanted to get him as a unique for the run home. Glad I did it. But I think he can go to the next level for sure.
I'm looking at what this Geelong fixture looks like, and it is hard to base 2024 opponent data in on top of 2025 and just draw the clean line and say they were like that as opponents to play against in 2024, therefore they'll be the same in 2025. It's hard and dangerous to do that, but there is one club I feel really confident on to say you can target this as a matchup and it will be favourable for you. That one opponent I'm alluding to is Richmond. The reason being is they've lost a quarter of their best 22 premiership experienced players, and they're all being replaced by kids. The good news, and why I'm bringing up Richmond, is for Max Holmes and for Geelong, their first game against the Tigers is after their bye in the mid-season at round 17. They play straight out of the bye, but it's not the only time in the last 2 months of the year they play the Tigers. They also play them in the final round of the year. You throw 2 Tiger matchups in the final 8 games of the year, and then there's a North Melbourne matchup in there that should still be profitable given their development. Where do the Bombers sit by that point of the year? Who knows? The Saints have been historically helpful to stream against in a couple of different positions, especially rebounding defenders. All of a sudden, to me, there is a world where if any of the variables pull through from 2024 of data and scoring, let alone those 2 Tiger matchups, I'm telling you right now, I'm pretty keen to jump on board Max Holmes in that final 2 months of the year. I think he's going to be the inverse of what he did for us last year. I think he's going to come home like a steam train given that fixture.
Yeah, so based on that, you'd probably err more towards picking him up during the year after you've had more of a look than starting and having him for the whole run. It's interesting. When you started mentioning that, I thought, I wonder what he scored on Richmond last year, but that was the game you missed.
No data for us, super unhelpful. So Max Holmes, is he relevant? Yeah, he absolutely is. Because despite having an early bye, we get an early look at this side and structure, and we give ourselves not just a community series game. We've got to value this free look at a squad and a structure and a score. While not impacting the points we gain, it impacts the price movement of a player. So we have to value this highly and not do what we did last year as a broad community, which was disregard top-end premiums that have an early buy, because there's a way and a world that Max Holmes is a fantastic starting option for us. There's a way and a world that I've exposed that at the back 2 months of the year, he could have one of the greatest fixture and matchup opportunities that sees you get those ceiling games that we've so longed for from Max Holmes. We could get them from him in the back 2 months of the year. So whether you're looking at him as a starter or whether you're looking in as an upgrade option, Max Holmes is knocking on the door as an option you need to consider for 2025. But Jordox, it just isn't the draft, the classic formats of the game. It is the draft format. And here at the Coaches Panel, we choose to draft on Keeper platform in 2025. If it's based on his average last year using Keeper scoring and AFL Fantasy scoring, he's an early D2 by average. And if you're drafting on SuperCoach, it's a similar mid to early D2. Is that about the spot you're happy to pick him, which is indicative of last year's average? Or are you confident, and if not confident, hoping that he's going to become a D1 in one or two of those formats for us next year?
Yeah, I think he's a D1 for 25. And if you could land him at D2, I think you're going to be really happy. So he could be a D1 for someone who wants to pick up an extra mid before they grab a defender or an extra forward, or you know what I mean? Like if others jump on the bigger D1s in Flanders or Whitfields and the like, you might be able to pick up Holmes at D1 and be laughing, because I think he's going to be, I think he's going to go well. So if he ends up your D2, that's great. But it just depends how you value the other lines. And for me, I always like to get a good, strong start in the midfield, and then, that forward line's going to dry up pretty quick.
Yeah, I think if you're attacking the draft early and looking at one of those top-end rucks or just going heavy mids, I'm really quite comfortable kind of in that fourth round of a draft, again, depending on coaches, league size, all those variables. If I get him as D1 in and around that early part of the fourth round, I'm really happy with that as my D1 if it's been protected with some other strong selections. Conversely, if those lines are all departed and you're going for a more defensive first approach, then I don't mind that as a D2 play as well. So I think his low ceiling hurts him a bit, but it's protected by a high scoring floor that kind of makes him much more confident, someone that I think is going to be a great pick on draft day. Hey, Jordox, always an absolute pleasure talking fantasy footy with you. I know I almost gave you the badge of being the AFL Fantasy Fanatics host, but, you had Bales on yesterday. We've got you today. Who knows? Maybe we'll get you to host something one day. But look, always a pleasure talking fantasy footy with you, mate. We'll have you back on the 50 Most Relevant, I'm sure, again, real soon.
Thanks, MJ. Great to chat, mate.
If you want a clue on who's at number 38, hang around for about 60 seconds. I've got a nugget for you that will hopefully help you figure out who this player is. But if this is your first episode listening or watching to the 50 Most Relevant, the good news is you've come in at a time where you can now binge back about a dozen episodes of this series. Wherever you're checking out this episode, just simply go back in time. You can check it out. They are just fully there with other members of the coaches panel and the fantasy football community. We'd love for you to go and check them out. If you're listening to this as an audio podcast, you can subscribe, get notified as soon as a new episode drops every day. It'll get to your device. And if you haven't given us a 5-star rating yet, the good news is you still can do that. If you're watching this on YouTube and you haven't liked this video, take those 2 seconds to do so and comment below with your thoughts on what Max Holmes is going to be for us in 2025. And in the description of the episode is where you can get in touch with us and find our links across social media, get access to some coaches panel merch. Yep, it's looking good. That's all I'm going to say. And you can become a Patreon as well. Get a bunch of extra rewards as well as supporting us during this 2025 preseason. All right, you ready for a clue of who's at number 38? Let's be bold and give you a real obvious one. Premium defender. That's the first clue I'm going to give you. And he has just delivered one of, if not his best ever season. And not only is he a premium, but there is a pathway early in the year where he can already outperform this hefty price tag. And it's huge upside. Who is this player? Joining me on the podcast will be the host of the Pod, Holmesy. Yeah, we've gone from Holmesy into a Holmesy tomorrow on the 50 Most Relevant.